Hey there, welcome to Wonderful Works Talks, where we talk all about the disability ministry mission of making churches accessible for all. I'm your host, Barb Stanley, and today we're tackling a big subject that almost every church struggles with: recruiting enough volunteers. Now, this topic is important to every church ministry, so no matter what ministry you care about, you'll want to listen up. But for those of you who are also part of the disability ministry mission, recruiting enough volunteers is even more important. Now, before we get started, I do want you to stop and ask yourself one big question. How would your church be different if you always had enough volunteers? That's right, I see you smiling. Well, today, we're going to learn what it takes to get there with our guest, Ministry Boost co-founder and author of the Volunteer Playbook, Nick Blevins. So, Nick, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, Barb, thanks for having me.
Well, we are so excited to talk to you about one of my personal favorite subjects and almost no one else's: recruiting for ministry volunteers for your ministry leadership team. Can you tell us a little bit about why you thought it would be a good idea to write this book, The Volunteer Playbook?
Part of me definitely wrestled with, like, when you even said author Nick Blevins, like, I don't think anybody's ever said that before in my life. So that's the first time I've heard that phrase. There's still that part of me that's like, I don't know about that. Because I don't think I ever thought I need to write books. That's not
Yeah,
something I ever thought I wanted to do. I do love and have always loved helping church leaders learn things. And part of it's just because that's me. My whole
right.
life, I've just learned from other churches, other leaders. I feel like the book is 95% things that I've just learned everywhere else over the last
Yeah.
20 years and just try to put it in some type of organized format for a
Mm-hmm.
leader that you could kind of get
Yeah.
everything in order of, like, what do you need the most, which is
Yeah.
usually recruiting volunteers, to building something healthy, in the long run. And then I would say it kind of over the years after doing this with churches and leaders through
Mhm.
a course and coaching and things like that, it pivoted a little bit to where it kind of starts out just like, well, here's how you recruit. Like, a
Yeah.
lot of people haven't been taught how to recruit or a system. So here's a system, do that. And then we'll start addressing the other things. Because there's part of it's like when you're leading in ministry, if you don't have enough volunteers, you don't have time to work on anything. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, you
Yeah.
have
It
no
just.
time to work on it. So if you can get enough volunteers
Mm-hmm.
early, to kind
Mm-hmm.
of steady things, then you can free up time in your schedule to work on your ministry instead of just
Right.
in it. And so that's kind of the rest of the books. Like, okay, you've got some
Yeah.
volunteers now, let's work on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was great. I am also a systems person, so I really appreciated the way you wrote the book, because it did help me follow along. It makes good logical sense and really gives you a step-by-step guide. But let's backtrack for a second and talk about why recruiting isn't a one-time push. Because we often see, like in the church, when teams get low, and that can happen. Um, it's almost like we've got to get up to the stage, we got to do this campaign, and that's kind of like it's an event, and then it'll be over. Why have you found that is not always the case?
Well, mostly because needing volunteers isn't a one time thing. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, a push will help. Like, I remember years ago, over 10 years ago, one of the times in our church, we've added services so many times over the years, going from two to three or whatever it is. And one of the first times we were going to a third service, it's a whole other service. And in children's ministry, we're going to need all these new volunteers.
Right.
And we did a push from stage. Our pastor really sold it. I mean,
Mhm,
he really made the case of like, hey, we're launching this. If you're sitting
mhm.
in this seat and you're not serving, I'm talking to
Yeah,
you, like, kind of
yeah.
thing. And I still remember, I mean, to this day, one of my friends, Rob Gedicke, was in one of those seats and stepped up to serve. And Rob has served so much since then. He's led
Mhm,
multiple student ministry groups, one group from sixth grade all the way through 12th.
mhm.
Like, it was a big deal. So the campaigns can work. And like it did there. And I don't know if that got us to 100%. I can't remember. But we got a lot of volunteers from that push. We launched that third service successfully. But
Mhm,
we needed volunteers again 3 months
mhm.
later, 6 months
Yeah,
later, whatever. So
yeah,
that's part of it. Is you can't campaign every 2 months. It just becomes
right,
white noise, whatever it is. Like, whether it's a
right,
push from stage or a big
right,
email, or you're getting people to invite other people. You can't do that every month, every other month. People just start to tune out. I
right.
think the big campaign push is a great tool,
Mhm,
but with two caveats. I think, one, you can't do it too often. And
mhm.
then two, you have to have a good system behind it. So when people do raise their hand to sign up, it actually works. Because a lot of times you get that big push. And I'll have church leaders tell me all the time that when they do a
Yeah,
big push from stage, half the people don't even respond to something. And some of
yeah,
that's on them, some of that's on the people, but some of that's
yeah,
on us and our systems. I think a good, like a plan for recruiting that can work all the time, every week, every month, all year
mhm.
long, is what's really needed, and then you add on like the campaign, the push, or
Mhm.
the different things throughout the year.
When you're doing that system that you have all the time, so the way we've looked at it before is almost like you're planting seeds all the time of vision of why your ministry matters so that when you do make personal asks or that push, people are ready.
hmm
What does your system look like? What are you doing the rest of the time that you're not doing the campaign?
Yeah, so what we teach in the book, what we teach in with Ministry Boost in our courses, is a five-part framework that we kind of created over time of doing this. And now that we've like led other church leaders through it, it's been great because we could kind of
Yeah,
adjust and make sure it works. And it really does work in every church size and setting. Now, there is some truth that you don't actually do the exact same thing every week because this is also something that could become white noise. Like a core
right.
premise of the framework is
Mhm,
that you're making a list of prospects, people who don't serve, and
mhm.
you're contacting them, and
Yeah,
you're either going to have a conversation with them, or you're going to invite them to a volunteer orientation. That's part of the core part of the framework. And you can't contact people every week, right? At least the same people. Even if you
right.
contact, like we teach you, you contact 3 times, 3
Uh-huh.
weeks in a row, and you're not, most people still don't reply. That's part, you'll look, if you read the book, you'll see that's why we put a big emphasis on having a large number of prospects, for your
Mhm.
volunteer recruiting. But if once people do reply and you're working on them, the people that didn't reply, you can't hit them up 4 weeks later. Again, it just becomes, at that point they're going to get annoyed. It's almost like
Right.
the door-to-door salesman or the emails you get
Yeah,
that market. Like
right.
I always say, we're not selling timeshares, so we can be very bold in our volunteer
Yeah,
recruiting. We don't have to feel
yeah.
bad about calling people to serve, but we also can't ask somebody every week for 12 weeks in a row. Like, what are we doing?
Right.
So there's even a cycle to the weekly thing where
Mhm,
you're working on it every week, but you might not be working on the same thing every week.
mhm,
Those first month, you're probably sending a lot of emails and texts, contacting people, and then you're working on talking with the people that have responded and communicating with them and getting them
mhm.
onboarded. And then, 2, 3 months later, you're running that cycle again and
Yeah,
contacting. And you can always contact different groups of prospects too.
yeah,
That way, it isn't the same people hearing from you all the time, which I think is
yeah.
helpful. But if you have a system like that every week, and every week again, are there
Mhm,
some weeks where you don't? Sure. Like if
mhm.
you're a children's ministry leader leading VBS, you're not doing any volunteer recruiting the week of VBS. You know what I
Right,
mean? You might not be doing any for the 3 weeks leading into
right,
VBS, which
right.
is fine as long as you come out of that and get that recruiting going again. You
Mm,
spent 0 hours for 3 weeks. Now you spend, let's say, 9 hours the next 3 weeks, and you kind of
mhm,
make up for it. But one of the things we'll say is if you can spend 2 hours a week, once you've
mm.
developed a framework, a system, if you can spend 2 hours a week, you'll be good.
Yeah.
You can recruit on 2 hours a week. Some weeks it's zero, some weeks it's four, but you can make that work.
So some of those weeks, those 2 hours might be sending emails to prospects. On those other weeks, what do you suggest? Is it vision casting or what are the other things that people can be thinking to do when they create their systems?
Yeah, good question. So I think your system has to have like a core premise of the book that I don't probably like say it this way in the book, but is you want to give people small steps to take on the way. I don't think I say this in the book, but in marketing, there's something called the yes ladder. And it's the
Right.
idea that if you can get people to say something yes to a
Yep.
small thing, they can say yes to the next bigger thing. I
Yeah.
said we're not selling timeshares, but like that's an
Yeah.
example. Like you say no if somebody wants you to buy
Sure.
a $20,000 timeshare.
Yeah.
You say yes though if they're like, "Hey, could you we want a free weekend at one of our timeshares and you'll come to an hour meeting." And then at
Mm.
the hour meeting, do you say yes to some other weekend somewhere?
Yeah.
And eventually you're saying yes. And it's just the idea that, a big jump is hard for people. I just did volunteer tours yesterday in our church, one of the things I
Yeah.
teach in the book.
Yeah.
And one of the guys I met, it would be very bold to say, "Hey, you're interested in serving. I'm giving you a tour. Can you give the next 7 years being a weekly small group leader for sixth grade guys in student ministry? Plus, there's gonna be some camps and retreats. It's
Right.
3 hours a week
Right.
times 30 weeks a year. Times, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that's a big jump. Whereas if
Yeah.
you can have a smaller yes along the way, so like practically, the
Mhm.
hours would change week to week, but for the most part, you're contacting people, you're
Mhm.
talking with people, you're
Mhm.
running them through what we call volunteer orientations, but think of that as like before you say yes to serving, not
Mhm.
after you. So this is like it is the sales pitch. It is when I'm gonna cast vision. You're working on those, whether planning them or running them or building them up, following up with people coming out of them. Then you got people who are onboarding. You're communicating
Mhm.
with them, training
Yeah.
them, following up with them. And at the same time, once you have implemented the framework, elsewhere in the book, I do talk about boosts and on ramps, which are sort of like the campaign thing, like the you don't do it all the
Yeah.
time, but you do it
Right.
sometimes. So if you followed the principles of the book, early on, you're working on contacting prospects, building your orientation, talking with people, all of those things. 3 months in, you've already done that and hopefully recruited a bunch of volunteers. Your 2 hours might go to following up with like a couple emails of people that are still in process, but you're
Mhm.
working on a big campaign. You're going to do a big push through your existing preschool rooms or something
Mhm.
like that. And you're going to roll it out, next month. And so that's where
Yeah.
the hours can be different, because it's not exactly the same, but you kind
Mhm.
of cycle it. 6 months later, you're probably running the framework again and
Mhm.
contacting a bunch of prospects and
Mhm.
all that. If you do run tours or an orientation, the way I talk about in the book, like giving people a taste of what it's like to serve and
Mhm.
casting vision and all that,
Mhm.
we recommend you do that every month, if not twice a month. And so you're always doing, at our church, we do them church wide once a month, and
Mhm.
I usually lead them. And
Yeah.
so I'm always working on that a little bit. There's always communicating, heading into
Yeah.
it, communicating,
Yeah.
heading out of it, all those things.
Well, there's so many parts of this I want to kind of dig deeper in that you just said. Explain what a volunteer is, and then give us some more detail when you say, I do these vision casting. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, and the vision casting and the tour really go together. So
Okay.
my co-founder, business partner Kenny Conley came up with the volunteer idea. He's kind of the master
Yeah.
of this. He's done this in so many different churches, different sizes, things like that. The idea is most people recruit volunteers to serve. Like you recruit somebody directly to serve. But
Mhm.
going back to that yes ladder thing, it'd be better to recruit them to an orientation or to a tour. The tour is a form of orientation. That's the best way to say it. Because if I say, hey, have a volunteer orientation where you're going to answer questions and cast vision for why people should serve,
Right.
most of us will picture a classroom with people in it.
Mhm.
There's a couple problems with that. One, nobody loves classrooms. But two, most churches aren't large enough to get enough people in a room that it feels good if you're doing it once
Right.
a month or every other
Yeah.
week. A tour is great because we've had tours at our church
Mhm.
that were 30 people and we split them in smaller groups and went and did it. And then I did tours yesterday. I did two people tour for two people first service, one person second service.
Uh-huh.
And so it doesn't matter how large it is or small it is, a tour works, and a tour is also great because you get to see it, right? You get
Yeah.
to look in the room, kind of talk
Mhm.
behind the scenes. Here's what that and I tell stories. Like,
Mhm.
you walk into a room, it's like, here's Debbie. Debbie's a coach in our elementary environment. She leads the volunteers that are in this room. They're small group leaders
Mhm.
for kids. She's
Mhm.
greeting people at the door. She's leading them throughout the week. There's just a way for them to like make it personal and kind of picture themselves in that
Mhm.
person's shoes. And so I think the tour is just an easy, simple way for people to say yes. Because like I
Yeah.
can sign up for a tour. I'm not saying I'm going to serve. I don't even know what I'm doing yet. So it's
Yeah.
great. I can go figure that out. I can ask questions, figure out like, are you going to keep me for the rest of my life? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
every potential volunteer has fears and questions. And
Mhm.
most of them they can't even verbalize yet. But if you can get them to say yes to a tour or an orientation, there they can ask them, and the tour itself addresses some of those questions.
Yeah.
And when you have them there, I think vision is one of the most important things. You're
Yeah.
talking about like when I do the tour, it's an interesting thing for me to do the tour because I
Mhm.
lead our kids and student team. But when I'm doing the tour and I have the whole church, I have the church wide hat on, right? I'm
Yeah.
selling all the ministries.
Yeah.
But the reality is student ministry and kids ministry are a bigger commitment than most of our other volunteer roles in the
Mhm.
church.
Mhm.
So I will go by our guest services. We'll talk about people in the parking lot greeting and people handing out programs in the service or working the welcome center. Well, they serve right now every other week, one
Mhm.
service,
Mhm.
and most of them can even go to the service they're serving it. So it's a very
Right.
small
Yeah.
commitment every other
Very
week
different.
for
Yeah.
30 minutes before and 10 minutes after the service,
Yeah.
right? It's pretty simple. And then at some point, I'm going to roll over to kids ministry and say, this is a small group leader who serves every
Mhm.
week, leads this group of kids. They're
Uh-huh.
here early for our huddle time. They're sticking around a little bit after. I mean, it's an hour and a half there at least. They're probably more than that, hour 45 minutes. And then you're going to put in some time prepping for the week. It's a 2 hour, 15-minute a week commitment
Mhm.
weekly compared to this thing I just showed over here that was like maybe 30 minutes more than you usually come,
Yeah.
every other week.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there's a part where you have to cast vision and I'm biased, of course, so I do that. I mean, I'm selling kids and student ministry. It's
Yeah.
not for everyone. I mean, that's the reality is
Yeah.
it's not for
Yeah.
everyone. But it's a chance for me to tell stories about here's why you might want to consider giving time out of your life to this role because this matters so much. Like Keith here, I call him Keith the baptizer because Keith has led fourth and fifth grade boys for years, and he
Uh-huh.
has literally baptized at least 30 fourth and fifth grade boys in
Yeah.
his time here at this church. How amazing is that? Like, how many of you have
Yeah.
seen a baptism? Yes. How many of you seen a kid
Yeah.
get baptized? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Keith is one of the ones that does a lot, and not because Keith is anything special. Keith would is so humble; he would tell you the opposite. But Keith shows
Yeah.
up and he invests in these boys, and I make those pitches, and
Mhm.
people hear that and they just start to think, I want to be a part of that. Like that's what you want them to think is not I don't know if I can do this or I got a lot going on in my life. Like they're thinking that already. So you tell these stories, you cast vision and start to make them sort of reprioritize in their mind. I want my life to count. I don't want my life to
Yeah.
just be about these other things that keep me busy.
I think this is such an effective way to build teams because what I'm hearing is not just it gives people a chance to feel like I can do this or learn more, but I would imagine that by the time the tour is over, they kind of know like I'm right for this or not. And getting the right person in the right role is really key to sustaining ministry teams. So how do you guys do that once you do the tour? Make sure you kind of match the person to the right role.
Yeah, there's probably a couple parts to it because it is a little messy. We let people check the areas they're interested in,
Hmm.
which if they just check one is great. When they check more than one, it gets a little messy because there
Yeah.
are certain people. It's like I just want to help wherever it's needed. Our philosophy forever has been no, we want you to help where you're going to best use your gifts
Right.
because that will help you stick long term. However, you probably don't know till you've done it. You don't have to be locked in forever to one thing. You really need to find your best fit. That's what's going to
Mhm.
help you stay long. That's what's going to help you see it as a privilege. I
Yeah.
love this. And so the tour helps with that too. But I do think having that open ended, like, let them try it for a season and then follow up
Mm.
with them 3 months in
Mhm.
or six
Mhm.
months in and see if it's still working.
I wanna talk a little bit more about this, but from the disability ministry aspect, because our recruiting, I think, is a little bit different than just general recruiting for children's and youth ministry, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But one of the things we have found that's important when we are recruiting for buddies or for classroom teachers for our special education, sensory-friendly classrooms, which is a little bit more specialized skills, is it's really important as a leader to understand what competencies you need in each role and kind of understand what you're inviting people to. I think, especially for disability ministry, because the stakes are a little higher, because a lot of people don't have as much experience.
Hmm.
So, one of the things we do is really, once we have people who are interested, talk to those people and listen, like put on your listening ears to see what they are really gifted in, and then try to know which roles they go to.
Hmm.
Um, is that something you guys do as well? Because you have some people maybe they're really good at administration or organization, and some people who are really good with patients or kids that are, have challenging behaviors. How do you guys
Yeah.
do that?
We do. I would say there's probably two levels to it at least, because I think
Mhm.
we do it at a high level on the tour. So on the tour, we'll
Uh-huh.
be like, we'll go by new here. And I say, in fact, this happened yesterday. One of the
Uh-huh.
guys that was in the first service tour, he checked off new here
Mhm.
and worship arts.
Yeah.
And I don't know what his musical thing was, but
Mm.
he was interested in new here because I told him, most of the people that serve here you love people, you might be an extrovert, or if not, you can play one. Like I'm an introvert, but I'll
Mhm.
play an extrovert at
Yeah.
conferences
Uh-huh.
and in my church lobby.
Right.
But either you're an extrovert or you can play one, and you love that. You love to meet new people, hear about their story, help them take next steps, like that. You can smile. Like these are all important things for new here. You have to seem like a warm,
Yeah.
welcoming, conversational person.
Yeah.
And he felt like he said, I feel like I have the gift of gab. And his wife was like, yeah, oh yeah, he can talk. And
Yeah.
so like we'll do it at that level, and even on the sheet under each ministry, it'll give a couple words to help describe like some of the key things there. But it's pretty high level. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Because like what you're talking about, I could see that being almost okay. You're interested in serving in our disabilities ministry. Let's have like you've checked that, and we've given you some high level indicators that this might be a fit for you. Some things you can like, yes, that's me. But then we have that interview where we actually go over some role descriptions, and here's
Yeah.
like what this one looks like compared to that one. For example, it'd be like if you have like we have a kids ministry large group, it's a
Mhm.
different volunteer role to host than it is to lead worship through music.
Mhm.
They're both on
Right.
stage, but they have a lot of similar qualities. In fact, a lot of our
Yeah.
hosts yesterday, a mother daughter host team did both. they hosted and led worship. So
Yeah.
but they're a little different. Like I could host, I'm never leading worship. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So again, back
Yeah.
to that no musical ability, no dancing
Yeah.
ability, no movement ability. Storyteller's another one. It's like you could
Yeah.
tell a Bible story better than be a host, maybe, or maybe you host
Mhm.
better, So that's where I think that level you almost need another conversation where you can give
Yeah.
them almost a job description. Here's what it looks like.
So, how important is having the onboarding process ready? Because I think a lot of times in churches, one of the places that's hard with building teams is after you recruit someone, you might lose them if you're not ready to take them
Yeah,
on.
true.
So, do you consider that onboarding prep as part of your 2 hours a week with your working on your recruiting, or what do you guys kind of look at that?
I do, yeah, because like our 5 part framework is essentially steps people take to go from not serving to
Hmm.
serving. So the fifth step is placed. Even that has
Yeah.
things you do, like
Yeah.
administrative things you do. Onboarding is number 4. And
Hmm.
so all of that to me is recruiting. And I didn't know this until I had worked with other church leaders for a while. So because this was never really the case in our church. We
Hmm.
definitely did not do a good job at some points onboarding people. Like we were losing people along the way, but not to the extent that I've heard. I've worked with some church leaders where they'll tell you that for every 10 people that say they want to serve, only 5 make it. And
Right.
whenever I hear that, I think something's wrong. There
Yes.
always will be people that don't make it. Like, you know what I mean?
Yes.
There's like that
Yes.
person's a creeper or, whatever.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's an extreme example of like, oh, you're not
Yeah.
making it because there's something either feels weird about you or there is something in your background. That happens.
Yeah.
But that's a very small percentage of people. So most people should either make it or they like you end up serving somewhere else. And yes, people will flake out, but
Yeah.
there's a direct relationship between like our how do I say it, management of the onboarding process and
Yes.
their percentage of chance of flaking out, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Like we
100%.
and it says something too. Like you don't want to have to hold somebody's hand so much
Mhm.
because they're just flaking out to get them to serve. I mean, they're not going to make a great volunteer, right?
Right.
So again, there are ways that people fall out of the process, but in my experience, if you have 10 people say, I want to serve, you should get 9 of them just in. 9
Agreed.
out of 10. It's the
Yeah.
1 out of 10, it's really
Yeah.
the 10 out of 100 that they flake out, they don't pass a background check or whatever. So that's a sign, like if you're
Mhm.
onboarding and you're losing half, a third, more than half, I mean, something's wrong there. That comes back to every step of the framework almost has its own framework,
Yeah.
so,
Uh-huh.
you know, the step with onboarding, I
Yeah.
teach in the book a 5-step onboarding thing, I think. The steps aren't magic, it could be a 3-step, a 6-step. You don't want a 27-step onboarding process, but
I do.
you want
Yeah.
you want something that's clear,
Mhm.
it is steps one after the other, and you're following up with people at each step along the way. And if they do it or don't do it, they're getting contacted. Like I didn't
Yeah.
fill out the background check. Okay, we got
Yeah.
to get back on you next week. And that's
Mm.
part again going back to what is the work you're doing every week. You're
Yeah.
sending emails about, hey,
Yeah.
looks like you haven't filled out that background check authorization. Can you do that today? Right.
Mhm.
That's part
Right.
of the recruiting process, and our ability to manage that well
Mhm.
will determine how many people come through it. What
That's right.
percentage. And yeah, and the other part that you didn't ask about, but I think is important
Mm.
is I think onboarding is the best time to train too. So like
Uh,
if you do it well, yeah,
Preaching to
you
the
just
choir. Yes.
and then
Yes.
yeah, and what you're talking
Yeah.
about with disabilities ministry is like you need this. I mean, you can't really survive without that.
No.
I think a lot of times in ministries, we will just throw them in there. And,
Yeah.
with very little, we did the handbook, you know what I mean? Like we did
Yes.
policies and procedures. And it's like, that's not great for retention. And it's also not great for their experience. I think you could train a volunteer to 80% of what they need in the onboarding process. And then the rest of the time they serve with you is getting from 80 to 100. Although I acknowledge you never really get 100, like it never
Yeah.
stops. But if you can get them to like 80% of where they need to be in the onboarding, I think it's great because that's when people pay the most attention. That's when they
Mhm.
show up. That's when they do. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's like when they feel like they're veterans 3 years in, some of the
Mhm.
great ones always show up. But then some of them
Right.
are like, I'm good. I got that.
Right. Right.
And so like they
Right.
usually pay attention, especially early on. They're like, I don't know if I can do this. They'll take
Mhm.
everything you got.
Yeah.
They'll listen, they'll learn, and which is a great thing.
Can you tell us a little bit about you talk a lot about storytelling in your vision casting, and I actually have in your book I marked here the story of the Little Red Hen.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, can you tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about that story and how we can learn from that on when we're talking to people about our ministries?
There's just so many, things out there that talk about the power of story. And I think of Donald Miller, who wrote a bunch of books
Mhm.
about his own faith journey, and then now has created a whole company around
Mhm.
marketing with story called Story
Mhm.
Brand, and has done really well with that. Why?
Yeah.
Because story is powerful. And I remember even when he started that, he talked about reading these different books about the power of story.
Mhm.
And I'm not gonna be able to remember any of the names now, but there was one. There's like that one that's like, oh, there's only 7 different story types, and every movie is the same. Like Star
Uh-huh.
Wars and Tommy Boy
Uh-huh.
are the same movie. It's a movie about a person trying
Uh-huh.
to find his identity and
Uh-huh.
figure out his father relationship and
Mhm.
take over as the leader. You know what I mean? Like it's just so
Yeah.
funny when you hear that they're there's a guide,
Uh-huh.
there's Obi-Wan, and then there's
Uh-huh.
David Spade's character as the guide, Tommy Boy. And you hear that, it's like that's weird. Those are definitely not the same movie. Um, but the whole idea that there's frameworks for story and
Mhm.
and part of it's because our brain, listens to that, remembers
Yeah.
that, relates to that better than just information.
Mhm.
And so I think when you're doing a tour, when you're doing orientation, when you're talking to somebody one on one about it, you really need as best you can to tell stories because you want to help them see themselves in the story of your ministry and your church. So the story of the Little Red Hen is about a boy, Kevin. Kevin was 6 years old, maybe, and he had learned about grace or in our children's ministry that month. And then I guess it was like a month or two later at school, they were doing the story of the Little Red Hen, which of course,
Mhm.
kids learn. And the point of the story is, right, you should contribute if you want to consume, essentially, right? But
Right.
the teacher's telling the story, Little Red Hen's getting food ready for dinner and going out, and who
Uh-huh.
wants to help? Nobody wants to help. Okay, now she's making the meal. Who wants to help? Nobody wants to help. Okay, now it's time to eat. Who should eat? And the teacher was setting it up so that the
Yeah.
kids knew you should not
Mhm.
eat if you did not help. And so the kids were on it, in the classroom, but not Kevin. Kevin was like, I think the Little Red Hen should let them all eat because God gives us grace and we should give
Uh-huh.
grace to others too.
Uh-huh.
Which is exactly one of the lines that he learned
Uh-huh.
during that
Uh-huh.
month of grace. And we were like, "Yes." You know what I mean? We were just so
Yeah.
excited. Little Kevin, grace is
Yeah.
such a complex topic. I mean, for adults, here's Kevin, 6 years old,
Mhm.
understanding it at his level at least, and sharing it at school. And I tell that story because that's what we're all about. We want to connect
Yeah.
kids to Jesus through the Bible, help them know who Jesus is, know who God is, how much He loves them,
Mhm.
help them follow Him for the rest of their life.
Mhm.
And when people hear that, and you could make that story whatever personal story you could come up with, it
Mhm.
takes them from this moment of like, what do I need to do? Do I have time for that? Will I be ready? What if I'm not good? To, oh man, this matters. Like, I want to be a part of Kevin's story.
Right.
I think that's what helps is you help people see it, in their own life
Yeah.
and where they can fit in, and hopefully help them do it in spite of all the concerns they have.
That's right. Yeah. So I read that in your book, The Story of Kevin and the Little Red Hen, and I loved it so much because just telling that story, this is the actual impact of giving your time, taking a leap of faith, stretching yourself. This is why it matters. That says more to people than 100,000 social media posters that say we need help.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
And I
Yeah.
think so often when we are approaching volunteers in our churches, we are saying what we need is what we need, what we need, what we need. But what people need to hear is why. Why does it
Yeah.
matter?
Yeah. Yeah, and when they can see it and hear it is really powerful too. Like when we did the
Yes.
tour yesterday, we went in our elementary room, and
Hmm.
during that service, so this was the first service, um, we have a kid who grew up in our church. I think he was
Hmm.
probably 6 when his parents started coming in because they came early, but our church started in 2006. And his name's Nate, and Nate is almost 100% deaf and has other special needs too. But for all intents and purposes, he's 100% deaf,
Hmm.
and he's been through our ministry, our kids and student ministry, and now it's one of the most beautiful things in the world because he does sign language for a girl who comes to our first service who is like fourth grade. And as the people were observing large groups happening, and Nate is standing off the side signing to her, and it was just really cool because she'll sign
Yeah.
back too, so they actually can have a
Uh-huh.
conversation, unlike what
Uh-huh.
other kids are doing. They're all supposed to just be
Uh-huh.
listening, and I don't know sign language, so I don't know what they're saying either. But it's just the cutest thing to see him serving in a way that had served him before, and now he's doing it. So he's
Mhm.
part of that group. He's basically an extra leader in that group, but primarily for her benefit, obviously. And so for the people watching, they get to see that.
Mhm.
But if I hadn't told them what was actually happening, they might. They can obvious he's signing. but why is he signing? You know what I mean? Like they might
Yeah.
even notice the girl that he's signing to.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's where people can get the picture of it with the
Mm.
why behind it. And
Yeah.
now they're like, okay, maybe
Yeah.
I want my life to matter like
Yeah.
that.
So I have a question about some of the leaders you have consulted with before. Do you find that sometimes leaders, when they're approaching recruiting, almost feel like they feel bad asking for help or like they're
Oh
asking
yeah.
for a favor?
There are some people, but it's very few who are wired to not have a problem with that. Like they're the people that will talk to people in the lobby and they'll ask people to serve and like they don't mind pressuring you a little bit. So I don't, and my mentor Jim Weidman, who I consider like the godfather of children's ministry or whatever,
Uh-huh.
Jim could invite he has invited people to serve off the street that don't even go to
Uh-huh.
his church.
Yeah.
Like,
Wow.
that's Jim. Now, I don't know if he's
Yeah.
developed that over the I actually
Uh-huh.
don't know because I haven't known Jim,
Uh-huh.
obviously his whole life, couldn't have,
Uh-huh.
but he could be anywhere and invite somebody so, like, he's a certain personality, that's not most people. Most of
Right.
us would have a hard time doing it in the lobby of our church, mostly from a fear of rejection,
Mhm.
which I totally understand, but
Mhm.
I think what I would say is, I go back to what I said before, we're not selling timeshares.
Mhm.
I think people are less willing to commit now than they were before the pandemic. So I think we
Mhm.
have to be even more bold. I think
Mhm.
without thinking of it, people are in their head thinking, I used to do this much. After during the pandemic, we did way less, and I love that. We're doing a little more, but I don't ever want to get back here again where I'm doing all the things I was doing before. And
Right.
again, I don't think they're actually thinking it like in that clear terms, but like that's in their mind. And so like when we're talking to them, the way I would say it is everybody's got a list. They haven't actually prioritized it, but it's somewhat prioritized, right? And in my mind, you've got God, family, your church, and everything else. I mean, you know what I mean? Like God, church, your family. I'm like, like, those are your top three. Serving, in my mind, is one of the top three, four things that every Christian should be doing if you're just talking about prioritizing time. So you want to be able to be bold enough to challenge people
Yeah.
not, hey, can serving in our ministry be added onto your list of 17 things and now you have
Mhm.
18? No. Can you stick this at number three or four and everything else is getting bumped down? And I don't say it that way, but
Mhm.
I will push as if that's what I mean. I don't feel like you're not serving for me. You're not serving for our church. You're serving for God. My
Mhm.
pastor says serving is a privilege. So,
Yeah.
like, if I keep all these things in mind, serving is a huge part of your faith development. So, take all
Mhm.
those things I just said, and all of that allows me to be more bold in asking. And then part of it is you do just have to work out that muscle of rejection and just kind of
Mhm.
be okay with it.
Yeah.
I have to look up the name of the book. It was about the whole book is about the fear of rejection, and then he does crazy thing. He asks for
I
crazy
read that.
things. You've read that, yeah?
Is it like 100 Days of Rejection or something like that? Was that
Maybe
it?
I think the book is a different title, but that might be like there. If you search on YouTube, you can find him because he'll like
Great
crazy
book.
things where he'll like ask, "I need
Yes.
donuts from Dunkin' Donuts in the shape of the
Yes.
Olympic rings. Can my
Read it.
son and I play
Uh-huh.
baseball in your backyard?
Uh,
We don't have a big enough yard." These
uh-huh.
things that people are definitely going to say no to.
Yeah, okay, I
But
read that book. Everybody in the world needs to read it.
especially if you're a recruiter, because part of
Yeah,
you, the book just teaches you that like to be
yeah,
rejection proof. That might be the name of the
yeah,
book. It just teaches you that, like, yeah, rejection is going to be part of life. And if you're doing
yeah,
something that matters, it's worth, just like
yeah,
recruiting, it's worth
yeah.
getting rejected 8 times to recruit two
Mhm.
volunteers.
Right.
And so if you can kind of get your mind there,
Yeah,
knowing that what you're asking for is good, it's good for them. This
yeah,
matters.
yeah.
It's not for you. Don't do it desperately, even if it
Mhm,
is desperate. People
mhm,
smell desperation. Don't
mhm.
do it with
Yeah,
vision, not with
yeah.
desperation.
I'll tell you what helped me with that because I'm probably one of those introverts that can play an extrovert sometimes too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so when you are like reaching out to people you don't know, that takes a lot of energy for some of us. But what helped me with that is thinking about what if no one had ever invited me in to serve in an area that totally fulfilled my heart and enhanced my faith? What if no one took the risk to ask me? What would my life be like now?
One of the things I should say, Kenny, my business partner, who I said does the tour, he'll tell people, look, like, especially when he's recruiting them like a weekly small group leader role and kids or students, he'll say, look, do this for 3 months. And I promise you, you will come back thanking me that I invited you
Yeah,
to serve. And if not,
It's so true.
you don't have to keep serving.
Mhm.
Nobody's ever come back and said, I don't want to serve. They all come back and thank him because he's
Yeah,
right. Why?
it's true.
Because we all want to be part of something bigger. We
Yeah.
all want our life to matter, and you cannot get in there leading kids or students and walk away feeling like this doesn't matter.
Do you have any story of a time when a leader did take that risk to invite someone to volunteer and that volunteer role really changed that person's life?
Sure. I mean, that's my story. I guess I was about 18, or it might have been right before I graduated. One of the ladies asked me if I would teach during a VBS
Mhm,
class. So
mhm,
VBS that summer, which I'd been in VBS, my whole life. If I would teach whatever the age group that was, the Bible story, I don't even know if it was every night or if it was just one night. But nobody had ever asked me that before, and I'm thinking, and part of me is like, I want to say no, but like you seem this nice lady that's invested in me, and I don't feel like I can say no, so sure. And like then never crossed my mind, that I might want to teach or do anything like that. And I, you know, did the best job I could. I prepared, and
mhm,
I loved it. I loved it. And it was like I never knew that. I never knew that I would love it. People were very kind, obviously, saying nice things, and that helps. Like that's something for us to remember when you can speak encouraging words to other people when they're using their gifts. They can remember that forever. I can still
mhm,
remember what they said to me back then. And that was the beginning of me serving in so many ways. Eventually my wife and I led a class ourselves, and we led our upward sports program. And some of that involved, we started a young adult monthly service thing where I would preach at it,
mhm.
usually. And none of that, I don't know how much of that would have happened if she hadn't said, hey, would you
Yeah,
teach this
yeah,
second grade VBS class or whatever.
yeah.
And I don't know that I never thought I was going to work for a church. That's part of my
Uh-huh,
story.
uh-huh.
Um, but I think all those ways serving, by the time I was working and this church was getting started, and my youth pastor, who was my youth pastor, had moved on to become a pastor. He asked me if I'd be his youth pastor,
Mhm.
and so for the first time ever, I thought maybe I would want to work in vocational
Yeah.
ministry. And then now here I am, 20 years later, been working for the church, helping other church leaders. All of it can trace back to her asking me to do that. And man, my
Mhm.
life is definitely different because of that. I can't imagine my life being anything but this.
What I love so much about your story is you said, "I wanted to say no, but you
Oh, of course I
didn't."
did.
Yeah. But I mean, but you didn't because she took that risk to ask you. Obviously, it was a stretch for her because it wasn't like you were volunteering. You weren't an easy
No,
ask, but
no.
she took that risk because she saw something in you and that changed everything. So how grateful are you that she asked you, that she took the risk of rejection to ask you?
So grateful, and not even just her, because I'd had my
Yeah.
youth pastor had asked me to do that thing before, and then he asked me to
Mhm.
serve in youth ministry once I graduated, and
Mhm.
I mean, so incredibly grateful.
I just want to just encourage any ministry leader that's watching this right now to just remember when we are inviting people into our teams, we are not just doing it to change the lives of the people that we serve, but it also changes the lives of the people who serve with us. And so while it might feel scary or you might feel like, oh, I don't want to burden someone with this responsibility, God made everyone to serve. And when we do not invite people in, we are robbing them of the opportunity sometimes to serve in exactly what they were made to do and change their lives. So it's worth the
Mhm.
risk. It's worth the risk. It's worth the risk.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, just think of the upside compared to this. Somebody tells you no.
Can you share how your faith has impacted your journey in ministry and everything that you're doing today?
Sure, yeah. My faith is my journey in ministry. It's so much
Yeah.
like we talked a lot about in this conversation, recruiting and volunteers, and all of that's under the banner of leadership or ministry.
Mhm,
But all of that is under faith, and we do all this for God. And so
mhm,
we never want to forget that. You never just want it to be, I don't know, like a business leadership book or whatever. I was in the library recently, which not the library, Barnes and Noble, which I'm never in Barnes and Noble because I'm like one of those people that only listens to book or gets the
uh-huh,
digital version. But it was one of my like sports my kids' school nights or whatever, and I'm
uh-huh,
just walking around. Hadn't been in one in I feel like over a decade, and I was looking at the business book section, and because that stuff does appeal to me. I love
mhm.
leadership. I love all that stuff.
Me
But it's
too.
like, and you too. And it's like,
Yeah.
but it's a reminder that all the good of that is
Yeah.
comes from God. It just all comes from the
Yeah.
Bible. It all comes from, and the Bible, like my pastor would say, the Bible almost never talks about leadership, which is true.
Mhm,
Now
mhm,
the principles are there and how
mhm,
Jesus led, and just all of that is in there.
mhm.
But it's all about faith and
Yeah.
serving and being the
Mhm,
least of these.
Mhm.
Leadership isn't like one of the things we'll say in our church when we talk about like volunteer roles that lead other volunteers. We'll say leadership isn't is just another gift. It's not a better gift, it's just a different gift.
Right.
And some people like it, some people have it, some people don't. It's not better than. It's not better to lead than it is to serve. The Bible would say the opposite. So my
Mhm.
faith, I got to grow up in a church where from early on I believe God loved me.
Mhm.
Um, I believe the church was a loving place, a great community. People cared for one another. There
Mhm.
were parts of it that were definitely outdated and weren't so cool to me, but when I got in student ministry, that changed because all of a sudden it was like, oh, this is fun and this is
Mhm.
cool and I like this. And so I just have grown up. I decided to follow Jesus and get baptized when I was 16, but I believed long before that.
Mhm.
And so I've always wanted my experience to be the experience that everybody else could have, that they could have a church
Yeah.
that loves them, whatever age they are. They
Yeah.
could get connected, find out about Jesus who loves them and that God who loves them unconditionally. And I always say that I feel like growing up in my church, grace was on tap. It was on overload. Like I did not grow up in a church that was um, more guilt ridden or like you condemnation or any of those kinds of things.
Mhm.
And so in fact, it was probably to the point where you were more tempted to abuse it than
Uh-huh.
than not. And I think in some ways that has served me well because that's my view of God. God that
Yeah.
is a God of wrath, but also is a God of love.
Mhm.
And so I and then one thing I probably took away from my church growing up is that more that like that I observed as I got older is that if you're not careful, the church can become an insider focused club.
Yes.
And if you're new to it, it's then hard to get into the
Yes.
club.
Yeah.
That was my church. And so one of the things I say years ago, I was challenged to write a personal mission statement. I want to say it
Mhm.
was like 2008 or something.
Mhm.
And I wrote to serve churches to help them reach their full potential.
Mhm.
Because in my mind, a church doesn't reach its full potential if it becomes insider focused. And I want every church to reach its full potential. And part of that's
Yeah.
because I got to benefit. My faith is
Yeah.
a beneficiary of a church that
Mhm.
was doing that. And I want to see every church do. That's why I wrote the book. Like the
Yeah.
book is another way
Yeah.
to get this helpful stuff. It's one piece of ministry. Volunteers isn't
Yeah.
everything in a church, but it's a big part of church. And I want to see every church have thriving volunteer teams and healthy
Mhm.
ministries and reach their potential and help people find and follow Jesus. And so I feel like my faith, still personal, it's its own thing, but it does drive everything else I do because I want that for
Yeah.
everybody.
I love it. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about Ministry Boost and where people can find your resources?
Yeah, ministryboost.org is the website. We started Ministry Boost a little over 5 years ago, and it's basically online courses, resources, and coaching for church leaders, primarily kids and student pastors.
Mhm.
So we do coaching. We launch groups. They run February to June, so we're gearing up for that. Um, and we do coaching, but most people probably find their way to us through our courses, like
Mhm.
online courses. Think Netflix for church leaders, but
Mhm.
again, mostly kids and student pastors. And just because of the nature of ministry, half of our content is about volunteers,
Mhm.
which it makes sense. That's what most of us are dealing with, whether it's recruiting or leading
Right.
or communicating with or empowering them to lead like staff. And then about half of them are ministry specific, small groups
Yeah.
for this or large group for
Mhm.
kidmin or whatever that might be. We package it all in a membership, so most people are members. They don't usually buy one course or whatever. And so for $27 a month, they get access to all those things. And then coaching is a little bit different thing. And we do get to work with churches too, like kind of like consulting on site.
Mhm.
Most of that has been in recruiting as well. Like we'll show up and
Mhm.
teach a whole staff how to recruit
Mhm.
and then coach them through it the next 6 months to implement the system. And I love that because the harsh reality is the majority of people that will consume our content don't do it without the accountability. You know what I
Yes.
mean? So that's the
Yes.
tough thing. It's like
Yeah.
you wish that wasn't the case because
Yeah.
obviously it's a lot cheaper to buy a book and
Right.
whatever it is, $17 and you just do it on your own.
Right.
But I'm the same way, so I get it.
Mm.
It took accountability for me to write the book. So
Yeah.
that's why I do love the coaching and showing up on site because a lot of times people won't finish it
Yeah.
on their own. But there's enough practical, helpful things too that you can like. A lot of people will take that and do it on their own, but like
Mhm.
that long term change developed over 6 months or a year, we
Mhm.
find that most people need coaching in order
Mhm.
just for the accountability to see it through.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what we do. A lot of free, try to do a lot of free content, free online
Yeah.
events. webinars, things like that, because it is church ministry.
Yeah.
These people aren't budgets aren't big in kids world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I checked out your website and it is amazing. And we definitely think people should take a look at ministryboost.org and definitely get your book. I can't say that enough times. I highlighted so many things in it because this recruiting and having good systems is so important for everything that we do in church. So, Nick, thank you so much for being with us today and talking to us. It has just been a great time, and I can't wait to hear how this impacts churches that are listening today.
Well, thanks, Barb. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation.
To learn more from Nick, please visit ministryboost.org. Listen to his podcast, Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast, and order the Volunteer Playbook today, available on Amazon. And don't forget, if you like this podcast, please subscribe and share with others, and then check us out at wonderfulworks.net. See you next time.